here. Let's see if we can, that will work. Okay, can you guys all see that? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second here. Okay, so roughly what I want to talk about, let me see if I can make this work here, is the plan is to talk about vision. I think of vision, maybe, a lot of us take sort of vision for granted unless you have problems with vision. I think we think of it as something that's sort of automatic and just sort of works for us in this way. In studying this for many years now, I think of vision as really an amazing computational system. And I want to give you a little bit of my view about that in the beginning to hopefully have you see that vision is actually doing some really amazing computational things as it goes along. And in fact, I'll tell you a little bit about, there's been a big area of research in perception about thinking about what people call Bayesian models. It's a mathematical way of thinking about how precise or how optimal vision is at solving visual problems. And I want to give you a little bit of that kind of flavor of that way of thinking that people have. At the same time, I'm going to talk a little bit about a contrast. So some of you who have exposure to some areas of psychology may know that there's a lot of psychology that talks about people as terrible decision makers, that there are lots of biases and heuristics that people use. And in some ways, I've been very interested in the interplay between these kinds of theories of perception, where perception is thought of in these very optimal terms, and where human decision making is thought of in these very heuristic or non-optimal optimal ways. And the research that I've been doing recently is really, we found we're kind of sort of in between these two ways of thinking about decision making and perception. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that, and maybe kind of propose a way to think about these kinds of really broad theories about how we think about perception and how we think about decision making. So that's the game plan for today. And again, stop me as I go along, and please feel free to ask questions. So I'm going to start with this idea of just thinking about vision as a computational system. And I can give you lots of demonstrations of this. I'll give you this one here. So if you can all see this, I think what you should see here is on the left, you'll see a kind of white moon or sun behind some black clouds. And on the right, you should see sort of the opposite, black moon behind some clouds. Is that what you guys all see? So that's a trick, right? So these are actually, if you look at these two stimuli, two moons that you might see, they're actually exactly identical. So their luminance is exactly identical. And yet when you're looking at it here, they look completely different, I think. You guys all get that? And so does anyone have a, so it's like, so, this is the physical thing that you're seeing there is completely identical on the left and on the right. Yet in one sense, you see it, I think we all see it really clearly as a white thing on the left, and on the thing we see it as a black thing on the right. Anybody have any thoughts as to why that's the case? Why is it that one is perceived as white and one is perceived as black?
Could it be like the possible shadows?
Mm-hmm. Like shadows from the clouds or things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like it looks like sort of like on one side there's like the clouds and there's like a shadow over the moon, which makes it appear that that shadow is black on the side on the left, and on the side on the right, it's the opposite of the thing, right? The clouds covering it are what's perceived as white, and then the thing behind it is black. Is that what everyone sees? Yeah, so I think that's essentially right. So your brain is making an interpretation of this scene very rapidly as like, oh, these are clouds in front, and I should interpret this sort of pattern of luminous, of dark and light in very different ways, even though they're the exact same physical stimulus, depending on what the context is around it. And this is kind of one demonstration that I might give you of what Helmholtz, who kind of was a philosopher and scientist who talked about perception as unconscious inference. And what he meant about that is that we get these things from our eyes, the things that we see, and we're actually doing a kind of a computational process that we would call inference. We're inferring things about the world. It's not just that they're coming into our world and it's projected into the back of our brains. So some of you who know about the visual system, our visual system is largely in the back of our brains here. It's not like if there's a screen back there and it's being projected there. It's like you get this information from the visual world and you have to infer the properties that are there, right? So you have to infer the fact that that might be a light thing or that thing might be a dark thing. And you're doing it unconsciously, right? So it's like, even when I tell you, and you guys all now know like what the difference between those two scenes on the left and right were, you still perceive it in the same way. So I can tell you about, and I'll show you a few more illusions as we go along. I think like, even as we know that these are the things that are causing us to see it in one way or the other, and we know that the physical luminance that we're seeing is the same, we still perceive it in that way. So it's a kind of unconscious computational process, right? So it's a process that our brain is going through every moment of our lives. We're going and interpreting the visual world, and it's not just the sort of physical things that are hitting our eyes, but it's a lot that's happening inside our brain that's causing us to be able to see things in and understand the world around us. So I'll tell you a little bit, I want to tell you a little bit about my background, a little bit about why I got interested in these problems. Oh, actually, I'm going to, before I do that, I'll tell you first what it is that we generally think about in the lab. So the goal of the research that we're doing sort of really broadly is to understand what is happening inside the brain, right? So we look at these sorts of illusions, these kinds of things that are happening in vision. And what I'm really interested in is what's happening inside the brain. I mean, it implies that there's all these really, I think, complex, intricate processes that are going on inside the brain that are allowing us to interpret visual scenes every moment of the day. And we want to really understand how it is that the brain actually does that. And that's the fundamental goal that we have. And I'll introduce you to this kind of way of thinking about this, which I'll come back to later, which has been very influential in the field broadly and very influential in my thinking too about how we should attack these problems. And this comes from a neuroscientist called David Marr, who was at MIT in the 1970s and 80s. He tragically died of cancer, and I think very young, probably before he turned 40. But he was very influential in kind of getting people to think about what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and how should we think about the problem in neuroscience. And he thought very broadly across different parts of neuroscience, perception, motor, and many different things. But he was, in this case, he was talking a lot about perception. He's thinking about perception. He said, well, really, we should think about the problem of understanding perception at 3 different levels. So he's famous for thinking about it. It's a kind of a computer science-like analogy, but I think it's helpful to think about it this way. So he would say, what is the computation? So in perception, I think, what is it that the brain is trying to compute? Well, the brain is trying to compute, in the case of what we just saw, whether that's a black thing or, you know, a black moon or a white moon, a bright moon or a dark moon. That's the computation that it's trying to perform. And then you say, well, underneath that, there is an algorithm, right? So, so when you said, oh, it has to do with the shadows cast by the clouds, you're actually proposing a means of being able to compute that thing, right? You're saying, well, what I must be doing, or my brain must be doing, is figuring out that that thing is a cloud, and then if it's a cloud in front of that, then I will say that it's a dark moon. If it's a cloud behind it, or or it's a different color cloud, then they'll say it's a bright moon. So that's the kind of, you're expressing, in a sense, an algorithm or way in which I can compute that thing that I'm interested in. And the final level, sort of below that, is what he would call the implementation level. So it's like, you can take that, algorithm, that way of computing the thing that we're interested in, and you can ask, well, how do you actually do that in the case of the brain? We're thinking about the cells of the brain, the neurons in the brain, in the cortex. How is it that they actually do that? And it's important. I think the thing that was, the thing of this framework that's helpful, I think, is that it separates out sort of these different levels of questions and says that they're kind of, some ways, can be somewhat independent, right? So implementation, I could study this implementation in the brain, or you could say, well, maybe I'm a computer scientist and I really want to study how you could actually solve this problem on a computer. And you might use the same algorithm, whether the clouds are casting a shadow or not, and you could implement them differently. You could implement it on a computer, and then it wouldn't be neurons performing that algorithm. It would be, transistors and logic gates inside a computer that would be doing it. So he thought of these things as being separate kinds of ways, levels of thinking about what the problem is. And I'll come back to that later. I think it's a helpful framing for the kinds of problems that we think about in perception and neuroscience. So how did I become interested in all this business? Well, to tell you that, I'll have to tell you about my first love, which was this thing. You will all recognize this as a primitive home computer. This is the Apple II Plus, which came out sometime when I was I guess it must have come out when I was in elementary school. And it was like this super big deal and exciting because computers, it's a time when computers were sort of coming from some big contraption inside a room that only some big corporation or a big university lab could have, into something that you could have at home. And then you can work with, the things that this computer could do are not so impressive compared to the things that your phone can do right now. I mean, this thing probably had 256K of memory. It's it couldn't really do very much, but we thought it was pretty amazing. And I should say, when looking at this, it looks sort of simple perhaps, but for me, it had the feeling of maybe your first experience with an iPhone or some iPad, some kind of really complex technology which works really well and has this kind of surface gloss. It looks beautiful and sort of mysterious how all the innards work inside of it to produce that thing that you look at, that you interact with on the outside. But what's really kind of cool for me about this computer was you interacted with it in this way. So you interacted with by typing in commands. And the commands were actually written in a kind of a simple programming language called BASIC. Actually, at this time, even though this was an Apple computer, this was Bill Gates wrote the BASIC interpreter. So this has a copyright both for Apple and for Microsoft. So you would type in commands. So you would actually be programming the computer in a sense to actually make it work. So it's a very different kind of concept. And one of the things you could do is you could pop down into a lower level. So this kind of like Mars levels. You could go down at this kind of lower level into the system, what's called assembly language. And assembly language is really kind of right at the guts of the computer. So there was this chip inside the computer, the 6502 chip. It was just like this really basic microprocessor. And when you jump down into this assembly language, you could actually control the microprocessor directly. Like you could say, well, I'm going to put a byte of, all you can do at this level is take a byte of memory and put it into a register, or move it, or add two numbers, or move things about. But what it really did was, for me, was it exposed that on the surface computer that was kind of seemed so complex and so amazing, all the things that it could do, at the bottom of it was this really simple structure of things that you could just move memory from one place to the next. You could see the registers, you could just see the operation of this machine. And it was actually, once you got down to that level, it was so super simple. And I was really taken by that. I was really excited by that ability to be able to understand how this machine could work at that really basic level. And that's been sort of a very, I think, influential way in way that I think about the human brain, as I'll talk to you about in a little second. I ended up as an undergraduate studying computer science for, I think, partially that reason, which mostly meant that I got holed up in an underground room with a lot of computers for 4 years, working on my undergraduate degree. And after I graduated, I ended up coming to the Bay Area to work for this guy. So I don't know if some of you are into computer games or know of Jordan Mechner. He was famous. So he has a long history. He was kind of a high school programmer. He programmed this game called Prince of Persia, which was sort of a big deal at the time. And there's been multiple evolutions of it. They've now made it into this into a movie. And he's developed a lot of computers. A very, very creative, smart guy. And he wanted to make a game at the time. It was a game. It was kind of a new move to make the game a game that was not for kids really, but for adults. He imagined something that would be a mixture of sort of movie and computer. And so he used this sort of rotoscoping technique where you film actors and you turn them kind of digitally and with artists into animations. And this will look a little bit primitive to you guys now, but it's sort of like this game that we built. So after undergrad, I worked for a few years in this company. It's this kind of I'll stop there. So it was really fun. We worked in this game. And now you can actually find it on your iPhone. We thought that we were going to make a lot of money in the game. It turns out, it sold a few 100,000 copies or something like that. None of us ever turned rich, but it was a really fun thing to work with a lot of different kinds of people. So it was like computer science people, movie people, game people, and different sorts of people. So I was doing this at the time after undergraduate, and then at the same time, I was sort of felt like a little, I should say, I feel like, with computers, it's like we understand the man-made machines, and it's easy, not easy necessarily, but, they're built to be understood by us, right? And I would sort of look around at the sort of natural world and think like, God, it's amazing all the things that creatures around us can do. Like you can see this bird doing this beautiful dive into the ocean and thinking like, God, everything that humans can do and engineer, while it's amazing what we can do and engineer, you look around the world and see how animals and humans can solve problems and how biology solves those problems. And I was just really fascinated by the idea that, that maybe we could understand more about ourselves and more about how the natural world solves problems. I was also very influenced by, I had taken a class as an undergraduate about what's called neuroethology, the study of like how animals produce particular behaviors and how their brains do that. And so you would study these very simple things like, so I don't know if some of you have had the chance to take a course like this, but you might study something like this. This is a crayfish escape reflex where you poke a portion of its tail and it flips its tail and it escapes away. It's a very simple behavior, obviously important for the animal. But what I thought was interesting is that they would show us, they would dive down into, the circuitry, the neural circuitry of this animal, where you could look at individual neurons and cells. There are motor cells, there are sensory cells, there's other cells, and they really could work out exactly how this worked. There's a sensory cell that when it senses the poke, it causes a set of signals that go through this small circuit essentially that cause a tail flip reaction. And this was sort of worked out some time ago. And what struck me about it was that it kind of reminded me of the computer, right? It was sort of like, well, I guess I'm missing the slide that I was going to show you, but it's sort of like down at this level of the circuit, the neural circuit there, you could almost think about it just like the way that we think about like a computer circuit that we'd understand. And that was what really drove me to go to graduate school, to see how far we could go with it. How far could we really understand like, behaviors and circuits at this level. So I ended up working in doing a bioengineering graduate program. I studied the monkey brain. We did sort of physiology experiments there. And then I did a couple postdocs actually afterwards where I switched from doing monkey physiology, trying to understand the monkey brain, trying to understand what I think is much more interesting and complex, and the human brain. And that's what I work on now, is trying to understand the human brain and perception. Okay, so that was just a short segue into sort of how I got to where I am. And I want to return to this question about vision and computation. So I want to introduce to you guys, if you haven't heard of this kind of formulation before, what people mean by perception as being optimal and Bayesian. So here's a problem, an inference problem, like the problem that we saw before of like seeing a moon, a dark moon or a bright moon. This problem might be, well, I'm seeing this bird and I want to understand whether, I want to infer whether it's moving fast or slow. And we could talk a lot about this, but there's circuitry in the brain from your eyes, obviously get visual input, and the retina goes through different parts of your brain into parts of what was called the top part of the brain, the cortex, that has actually neurons that are like exquisitely sensitive to motion. So this has been well known and well studied areas called like MT, where you can find neurons that are very selective for the direction of motion or speed of motion of visual stimuli. And so the inference problem that you might set up is, well, okay, I see this bird, it causes some neurons inside my brain to signal something about the speed. And so the inference problem can be thought of as a kind of probabilistic problem. So you can say, well, from that information, I can, which I'll call sensory evidence, because sensory coming from my eye, it's evidence about what I see in front of me. I can think of it sort of I can think of it as like, well, what what speed is this thing moving as? Is it moving slow or fast? I could think of it as a probability distribution. It's like, it tells me that it's most likely that it's moving at some particular speed, and it's possible that maybe the sensory, information is slightly wrong. So it could be a little bit higher, or it could be lower than that speed. But you can think of it as sort of, it tells me roughly like what the speed is as a kind of distribution of possibilities. So it's most likely that it's the one at the middle of that distribution, or it could be like, it could be a little bit faster, it could be a little slower. And this is the framing of sensory inference in terms of what kind of a statistical language that is very common now in how people think about perception. So now I'm kind of framing it as like, oh, I'm inferring something, and I'm trying to statistically think of it as like, it tells me about the speed. So then the question might be, well, what happens if it's hard to see this bird, right? Like maybe it's a cloudy day, or maybe I just got a really brief glimpse at it. Well, maybe then, the neurons that are sensing the speed are not going to be as reliable, right? So if it's hard to see, it's like, they're going to, in a sense, they're going to be confused about exactly what the speed is. And in a statistical way of thinking, I could say, well, that makes my sensory evidence, my what's also called likelihood function sensory evidence, the probability distribution would be wider, right? We mean that like, well, it's likely that it's this speed, but in the middle of that, but it's still possible that it's a fast speed. It's possible that it's a slow speed. I'm not quite as sure as I was when it was really easy to see. You guys get that idea? So it's thinking about these things as a probability distribution. And so then a lot of people point out, well, what should you do in this case? Well, you might want to use some other information that you have. And you might want to say, well, it's not possible that it's moving as fast as an airplane, right? Because it's a bird. It must be moving at some speeds that a bird actually moves at. And that would be information that you're bringing to the task that isn't right in front of you. It's like you have some memory of that, or something about it. And that would be called, in this language, it's called a prior. So it's prior knowledge that I have. And the way that people think about this in Bayesian inference is that you take a prior, you think about it as a distribution. So it says, like, it's most like this distribution is showing it's most likely that it's moving extremely slowly. It's less likely that it moves faster. If you're aware of like how this works, if you've taken a statistics class you might have encountered the idea of like how you can combine these two pieces of information, prior and sensory evidence. And that's by multiplying them together to get what is called in this literature a posterior, right? So that distribution turns out, you can prove, is the best way to combine these two pieces of information. Right? So it's the best way to combine my evidence, what I'm seeing, what it tells me that it's seeing, and this prior information. And so I get this posterior, and then now I can guess what it is. And what you'll notice, right, is in this case, the posterior is in between the evidence and the prior. Well, what does that mean? It means that, well, I'm seeing this thing, and it's likely that it's moving at some speeds, some faster speeds, but my prior is telling me, well, it's probably slow. And so the best thing to do is kind of guess something in between. Right? So that's what that red distribution is telling you. It's like, the best thing to do is to choose something in between. That's a compromise between those two pieces of information, your evidence and your prior. And this has really now become a very fundamental way in which people think about a lot of perceptual processes. I'll stop for just a second as I go to the next slide to see if anybody wants clarification or wants to ask a question. You all good with that framing? Okay, I see some nodding, that's good. So the question is, so that's a nice story, right? That tells you like, that's the right thing to do. Mathematically, that's the right thing to do. Is this actually true? Do people have a prior? In this case, I'm sort of depicting the idea that you have a prior for things moving slowly. So the distribution is more likely things move slowly than fast. I'll just show you some evidence that people have that that's actually the case. So it's been well known in the literature that if you ask people to make judgments about things that are moving at the same speed, but you change their contrast. So the thing on the left is low contrast, the thing on the right is high contrast. This may not be evident in what I'm showing you here because it's somewhat a subtle effect. But the thing on the left, if we ask people to make judgments, people will usually say that thing is moving slower than the thing on the right. We can do this in the laboratory in really controlled situations. And almost anybody who comes into the lab, we can show that this is the case, that the thing that's lower contrast looks like it's moving slower, even though the two things are moving at the same speed. in Bayesian language, what people are thinking is happening here is that when it's high contrast, it's easy to see, right? So it gives you lots of sensory evidence about the speed. That's that blue distribution. And it's very peaked because it means that like, oh, only one speed is really possible. It's not possible that there are other speeds. And it turns out mathematically, if you multiply a prior and a peaked likelihood function, you don't shift it that much towards the prior. You essentially just you say, well, I mean, in sort of a more common language, it's like if you see something obviously in front of you, even if you have knowledge that like, other things are possible, you're just going to take the thing in front of you, right? You're not going to be like, oh, I see it moving really, at this speed. And even though I know that like, there are other things that move slowly, I'm not going to use that information because it's just obvious to me. And that's just really all that the Bayesian inference is telling me. It's just saying, oh, if it's really easy to see, just go with what it is that you see. The case on the left is when people think is like, well, that low contrast means it's kind of contrast is the difference between bright and dark, right? So it's like it becomes harder and harder to see as the contrast is lower. And what that means is that like, well, your speed, what you see in front of you is kind of ambiguous. It's like it could be going fast, it could be going slow. In that case, you're going to be really much more drawn to your prior because it's like your evidence. The other way to say it is like the things that you see are not, it's not, it's hard to see what's out there. So you can't trust what it is that you see. So you kind of go with what you think beforehand, your prior, right? So you might shift a little bit more towards the prior. And that's the way that people would describe this kind of thing in terms of Bayesian. Okay, I'm going to show you one illusion here. So this is an object. So maybe you guys can point which way you see this thing moving. And everyone's just pointing in your screen to see it moving. Yeah, okay, so a couple of you are happy to, okay, good. So now a few of you are pointing, good. So you see, so everyone sees that, right? It's like, it's something that's moving up and to the right. That doesn't have to be the case. So this is called the aperture problem, and you're seeing something through an aperture. If I make it now transparent, now you can see that what actually was being shown here was something moving left and right, right? It could actually not, it doesn't have to be moving left and right. It could actually be, let's see if I have this here. It could be moving up and down, right? Right. So that same motion that you're seeing through the aperture could be moving up and down, or it could be moving left and right. You guys all get that? Oops, I'm gonna just start again there. And if I go back, right, I think even though you know that it could be moving left and right, I think this also happens as you're watching it. Even though it could be moving left or right, when the aperture covers it, which direction do you guys see it moving? Do you still see it moving left and right, or do you see it? Yeah, right. So you start seeing it. Even so, it's again this kind of weird illusion, right? It's like, I'm showing you the thing left and right. As soon as the aperture covers it, your brain goes, hey, it's not moving left and right. It's definitely moving left and right. And then I reveal it again. It's like it's moving left and right. And like, okay, I see it's moving left and right. And then it gets covered up. And any thoughts about how one might explain this in terms of a Bayesian inference?
Does our brain just kind of fill in the gap for us?
Yeah, it's filling in. Yeah, I think that's right. So it's filling in the gap for us. So what do you mean by the gap? What is the filling in what gap?
Since we don't see that it's moving left and right, it kind of just like makes us assume that it's going to the right all the way.
Yeah, it's making us assume. So I think what you're saying, right, is like filling in the gap means that like when I see it behind the aperture, I can't tell what direction it's actually moving, right? Because the motions are consistent. There's many different kinds of motions that are consistent with what I'm seeing there, right? So your brain has to, and this is kind of an interesting thing about perception. Our perception never assumes that multiple things are possible at once, right? We don't see this as like, oh, this is an ambiguous thing. It could be moving in all these different directions. I don't have a perception of something moving in lots of different directions or possibility of moving. I see it as moving in one direction. Our brain resolves ambiguity by choosing one particular direction of motion, right? And I think that's what you mean by filling in the gap, right? It's trying to resolve that ambiguity. This is an ambiguous motion. anyone want to venture as to how this links to what I was saying before about the possibility of a prior for slow?
Is your brain essentially creating a prior or sort of feeling that in your mind?
Yeah, is the brain creating a prior? So the brain has a prior. Yes, so it is using a prior. So what is the prior here? So it's taking all these ambiguous different directions of motion that are possible. What prior do you think it's using to disambiguate that?
So if you saw it before, whether it was moving up or down or left or right, you seeing that kind of, now that you know that it moves that way, you sort of, it's sort of resolved, and like you think, now when it's covered, you think, oh, I still know that it's moving up or down. So that's
Yeah, so
fine.
you could be using a prior like that, like a short-term prior that I knew there was moving up and down before, and then now when it's covered up, I could use that prior to disambiguate the motion. I think that's not what most people see here, right? Because most people, if we go back to it moving and coming in and out, I think what you see as it's moving up and down, what you say is totally right. You would expect what the brain should do is that then it should use that prior to then disambiguate the motion when it's covered up. But it doesn't seem to be doing that, right? So it seems to be using some other prior.
Um, is it using like just salt in a way when you don't see the giant diamond, then you kind of use just salt and it kind of follows the line that's natural. But then and that's kind of like the prior when you don't have the full sensory stimulus, but when you do have all of the sensory evidence, then you can put the picture back together.
I think he said a whole bunch of different things that I like. So you sort of mentioned this sort of line that you have there. It's like that's ultimately the ambiguity of this thing, right? It's like there's a line there. You don't get to see the corners, which are in the other pieces of the object, which give you the information. So it's like and then I think you said that you kind of go back to what is the natural motion, right? In this case, the natural motion is to think that it's moving kind of perpendicular, I guess, to that edge, and I think that's the right way to think about it. What people noticed in a theoretical paper a few years ago was that that direction is the one that's associated with the slowest speed, right? So it's also, in some sense maybe the natural one. It's also the one that's consistent with slow speed. So if it were moving in that direction, that's the direction that it would have to move to make the slow speed. If we're moving up and down, it has to move a little bit faster up and down to give you that same motion up there. And so the link, but the link that people made with this kind of idea for having a prior for slow, and these kinds of illusions was that, well, maybe what the brain does by default, instead of using what it should do really in some sense, like use the prior information from a few seconds before that it was moving up and down, it goes back to the sort of default idea that maybe it kind of does this computation, says, hey, slow things are more likely than fast things. So when it's ambiguous, I'm just going to see it as a thing that's most consistent with slow. Does that make sense to you guys? So that's a kind of framing that people will give in vision for these kinds of problems, perceptual problems. This is one particular problem. I think it's sort of interesting because there are a lot of kind of sort of what appear to be weird motion illusions like this, where I love illusions and so you puzzle over them after a while. And what's sort of interesting, I think, in perceptual science is that people start to think about, well, what is the bigger picture here? Is a weird illusion that you can show? And then you say, well, there are lots of weird illusions with motion. It has to do with like parallelograms that are wide or narrow and which way they look like they were moving and so forth. And these authors who wrote this paper, theoretical paper about it, said, oh, you only need this one principle. You just need this principle that the perceptual system has a prior for slow, and it disambiguates according to that. So it chooses, when things are ambiguous, it chooses the direction of motion that's consistent with the slowest thing. And then you can explain that like a ton of perceptual phenomena around motion. And that was super exciting and cool. And that's kind of like one thing that like perceptual scientists are really looking for, is like, can we get a bigger sort of theory, a picture of things that explains a lot of different phenomena. And this is one example of where a Bayesian theory really helps to explain a lot of kind of what others would be sort of weird tidbits and hard to understand pieces of illusions that you see with motion. Okay, so that's one view. That's the optimality in perceptual inference. I'm going to switch and go to thinking about a whole other set of literature that I've really been fascinated over the years from psychology, thinking about people as terrible decision makers. Sort of one way to think about this. So I'm going to give you this problem. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Kahneman and Tversky's work. They're very famous for these kinds of what they call cognitive illusions. So it's very interesting. Danny Kahneman started out as a perceptual neuroscientist. He was interested in perceptions. He is also fascinated by illusions. The illusions that I just showed you suggest sort of an optimal view of perception. Like you can explain them in terms of Bayesian optimal kinds of things. He came into he met up with Amos Tversky, and then they instead of doing perceptual illusions, they thought about cognitive illusions. And this whole literature of cognitive illusions suggests that people are not at all optimal, and that was really what they became very famous for. So if you haven't seen these problems, they're really fun, and if you ever get a chance to read some of these papers, they're really just awesome, cool, funny papers, funny and interesting and brilliant papers. And this is, I'll give you an example. So this is a kind of example that Kahneman and Tversky would ask. They would give people this kind of question. They'd say, here's a guy, Steve. Steve is a person drawn randomly from a group of 30 engineers and 70 lawyers. What is the probability that Steve is an engineer? Okay, so this should be, given this, it should be, well, that's fine, right? That's a just elementary statistical problem. If he's just chosen at random, he's more likely to be a lawyer than an engineer. Right? No problem there. They do this manipulation, and I'm going to give you this manipulation and see how many of you, what you guys think. So they say, well, Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with little interest in people or in the world of reality. A meek and tidy soul, he has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. So what do you guys think now? Do you think he's an engineer, or do you think he is a lawyer? If you feel comfortable raising your hands, the ones I can see. So how many people still think that he's a lawyer? How many? Okay, good. And then how many people think that he's an engineer? Okay, cool. A few of you switch. So and so I guess you have certain prejudices about what an engineer is meant to be. That they obviously kind of deviously constructed this little scenario to evoke our kind of prejudices about what engineers are like. I consider myself an engineer, so I feel it's okay to be slightly show you this. So yeah, most people will do that. Will say that, okay, he's an engineer. And this is entire, you could think of this problem again in sort of Bayesian terms. So you could say the prior here is, I know you're choosing from a population which are mostly lawyers, so that's the prior that you're choosing from. You gave me some evidence. So now we're not talking about sensory evidence, but we're talking about evidence. I gave you this little paragraph and description. The evidence kind of points for a lot of us to like the classical view of what an engineer might be like. And so you combine the evidence and prior. The evidence is super strong for you. The prior no longer matters because you think the evidence is really strong. So your posterior then says, well, okay, Steve is going to be an engineer. So nothing wrong with this, right? This is, well, unless you're worried about the prejudice against engineers, but like there's nothing wrong with this logic, right? It's Bayesian, right? It's like, it's the right thing to do. I should ignore my prior information if my evidence is really strong. The manipulation that they did was then they would provide these kinds of descriptions, which beforehand they tested on various groups to see whether this was evocative of either a lawyer or an engineer, and it isn't. And so I'll read it to you. Steve is a 30-year-old man. He's married with no children, a man of high ability and high motivation. He promises to be quite successful in his field. He's well liked by his colleagues. Does that change your opinion? So what do people think now? Do you think how many people vote for engineer? How many vote for lawyer? So lawyer. Okay, so something come on. Engineer. Okay, well, I'll take it that you guys are very good Bayesians. So a lot of you, most of you switched back to lawyer. Anyone want to tell me why you switched back to lawyer?
I switched back because the description doesn't really tell us like anything about his personality. You can be an engineer and a lawyer and be like, have high ability, have high motivation, be successful. And so like just I think my mind reverted back to like the basic probability, and I picked lawyer because he's more likely to be a lawyer based on the numbers given to us.
Yeah. Well, you guys are all very, very smart, and that is what you're supposed to do. When you actually ask people in general to do this, they often say it's 50-50. They often say it's equally likely that it's an engineer or a lawyer. And what they know is that what basically that means is they're not doing what you just suggested that they're doing, like that to do, which is you revert back to the prior because the evidence doesn't give you information either way. They're taking the evidence even though the evidence doesn't give you any information, right? And so this is an illusion that they would call base rate neglect, and base rate is just another word for prior. So they would say what people are doing is they're ignoring the prior even though they shouldn't be, right? So you did exactly the right thing. That's awesome. You said, well, you know, the evidence doesn't tell me either way, so I'll just go back to whatever the prior tells me to. The reality is that most people don't do that, and most people neglect the prior or base rate neglect. And so Kahneman and Tversky are famous for showing you lots of kinds of cognitive illusions like this, in which people, you know, basically kind of break the laws of optimality. They don't do the right thing anymore. Okay.
I think someone, I'm sorry. I think someone just had a question in the chat.
Oh, okay,
yeah, I can read it for you. So Nancy, she had asked, was this variable given after the last one or on in place of it? Nancy, if you want to clarify what exactly the variable is, that would be.
Yeah, this was a question about, so when I read the second variable, the description that could apply to either an engineer or to a lawyer, because I had just read the last description, I felt primed to interpret it towards the other option. And I was just asking, was it given to a group of people who had not received the other variable? And this was the only character evidence they were given.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. I think when they did this, they would do them in different sorts of groups. But you're totally right that you know, you can essentially prime people for one choice or the other, because if you did in the order that we did, then you know you kind of are you're primed to think about the problem differently than when you see it in isolation. They actually also have a lot of work about that kind of effect, which I might call they might have called like an anchoring effect. Like if you're given sort of one set of information in the beginning, you sort of anchor onto that when you get the next piece of information. So, but yeah, you're totally correct. I think that when they did these experiments, they were careful about those kinds of things. So they would mix groups up together, and it's fairly convincing that like people will show this sort of base rate neglect, even if they know what the prior is, even if they haven't been primed to, you know, focus in on the evidence. But, you know, I should say that there's been a long history of back and forth in the psychology literature with people pushing back against this in sort of the ways that you're suggesting, right? By saying, well, you know, maybe you got to think about the context, you got to think about like how people are doing, you know, and you can actually push people in the right direction. And I totally accept that, by the way. I think that what we should actually think in terms of people's behavior is that people can be optimal, just as like, you know, some of you interpret this problem correctly. So it's not like people are one thing or the other as decision makers. We can be Bayesian, we can be optimal. A lot of times we're not. You know, I think because heuristics and shortcuts that we take are sort of easier for us to think about. So, you know, it's not like human behavior, and I really don't want to say anything about human behavior being as one thing or the other, because I think human behavior is incredibly complex. There's lots of different things that we can do. I think the outcome from Kahneman and Tversky's work is that often, you know, without being really pushed very hard on things, you're going to end up not in a very Bayesian optimal way, that you'll make sort of mistakes that are common across a lot of people.
Thank you.
That's a great question, though. I'm going to take you through the last few minutes. I'm going to take you through just an experiment that we did to try to, that I think sort of for us started to make us, this reason I started to think about like this connection between optimal Bayesian explanations of perception and this kind of other literature of perceptual decision making. So this is my postdoc, postdoc Steve Laquitain, who worked with me on this. He designed this task, which is a direction estimation task. You're seeing it on the right, where you basically see this kind of patch of weird dots moving in different directions. And then you get to turn a knob, which causes pointer to move around to report which direction of motion you see. So you just do lots and lots of trials. Experiments in my lab tend to be really, really kind of dull for some of the subjects, but you know, we think they're interesting to interpret. So you have people do this over many trials. You have to turn the knob, see the thing, say what direction it is. Make sense? It's a very simple task. And you can control two things. You can control the sensory evidence. You can control how easy it is to do the task. I don't know if it's easy to see here, but what I'm doing from the stimulus from the left to the right is I'm changing what's called the motion coherence. So I'm changing the percentage of dots that are moving in the same direction, same coherent direction. On the ones on the left, not all the dots are moving in the same direction. And it should be, you can make it so that basically it's harder to see the direction of motion on the left and it's easier to see in the direction of motion on the right. And that's our way of changing sensory evidence. So more sensory evidence on the right, less sensory evidence on the left. It's harder to do the task just by what you see when the coherence is low. He can also change the prior by doing this. You're in this task for like 200 blocks or 200 trials, which is about 10, 15 minutes. And within those 200 trials, you either show almost always the same direction of motion, right? So it's always moving up and to the right, for example. And so you learn very quickly, it's like, oh, the motion is going to be mostly up and to the right. Or you choose directions of motion that could be almost any different direction. So then you don't really develop a strong prior anymore. So it could be any different direction. So across trials, there's no real information about what direction the motion is. The way that he did this technically is there's a distribution of trial directions, and it was always the mean of that direction was always in one direction. We just changed the width of the distribution. So the ones on the left, you would see lots of trials with different directions of motion. The ones on the right, you would see only a few different directions of motion. The idea was the one on the right is a very strong prior. You learn very quickly that going into the next trial it must be the same direction. I keep seeing the same direction. The one on the left is a very weak prior because on different trials you just don't know what's going on, right? It's like you see different directions. So no prior information coming into the trial. Does that make sense? We have the idea is to manipulate both prior and evidence. And what he found was basically people seem to at first glance seem to do what you would expect from a Bayesian explanation here. So the Bayesian explanation, didn't need to go there. So first is that if the sensory evidence is strong, so this is a high coherence one, so this is where you can really easily see the direction of motion. The Bayesian explanation is whatever your prior is coming from the trial, ignore the prior, you can see it right in front of you. So just take that direction of motion and turn the knob to that direction of motion. You can see it very easily. And that means your posterior is going to be very, in the Bayesian language, it means your posterior is kind of basically your sensory evidence. It doesn't get pulled to the prior very much. The way that you can see it in this particular graph is that I'm plotting the direction that the motion direction that was actually shown versus the direction that they estimated on this axis. So a straight line through that means that they're turning the knob to the direction that was actually shown. So a straight line through that thing means that people are just going with their sensory evidence. They're dialing in what it is that they see, and so good. So I mean, nothing really surprising there. It's just like you're doing what it is that you see. If you make the motion coherence low, that means it's hard to see. You can't really tell. So it's like you're looking at these dots that are kind of flickering around, kind of like I'm not sure. It's maybe that direction, that direction. What Bayesian inference tells us that you should do is you should be more drawn to your prior. I can't trust what it is that I see in front of me. I'm going to be a little bit guided, pulled towards like what the prior is, and the prior should be like what I've seen in the previous trials. And just that turns out to be true. The way that you can see it in the graph is the prior direction is that horizontal line there. And if all the choices were towards the prior direction, you would just see points that lie along that horizontal line. And what you see is that as opposed to the top graph, it's kind of tilted up in different conditions there. It's a somewhat subtle effect, but it's a very reliable effect that we can see that people are drawn towards the prior direction. So good, everything looks Bayesian. Steve did this for a number of different conditions. He analyzed both means and standard deviations. We were all set to go. We're like, okay, cool. Everything looks sort of Bayesian, and we were planning to do some other experiments using this. But he noticed something. Yes. So people seem to be acting Bayesian here. When Steve looked more carefully, though, he found that people were, in a sense, were tricking us a little bit. And what he found is that the prediction of Bayesian is if I have a prior and evidence, like in this case of this evidence is the dots in front of me, priors is the information from the previous trials. Then my posterior distribution, the distribution that now after combining those two things should be a single bump, right? It should mean that depending on the strength of the prior and the strength of the evidence, the bump is going to move around in between the two different things, but there should be a single bump, a single distribution of directions that you choose. So if it's like prior and evidence are equally strong, then you should have a bump of estimates that are sort of right in the middle there. Turns out that's not what he saw. He would see things like this, where there are two bumps in the data. So instead of seeing a bump sort of right in the middle between these two distributions, he saw that there was a bump near the prior and a bump near the what I'm calling the likelihood or the evidence. What that means is that on some trials, people were choosing the prior direction, the direction that they know from prior trials is the most likely. And on some trials, they were choosing what it is that they saw in front of us. Instead of on every single trial, they should have been choosing something in between. They were choosing differently on different trials. Does that idea make sense to you? Because that's the sort of key thing that Steve found with this. And so what this suggested, or what, and he did a lot of work to show this, is that what people are doing is they're switching between prior and likelihood. On average, that gives you the same answer, right? Because on average, you choose the thing in between, right? Even though on any given trial, you're choosing prior and likelihood, when you look at an average, it looks like you're choosing what is Bayes optimal, sort of the thing that's in between. But you're not actually doing it by choosing, by doing what Bayes' rule tells you to do, which is multiply prior and evidence to get a posterior distribution in between. You're switching back and forth. And what Steve thought was like, this is kind of heuristic, right? Because maybe what's hard for the brain to do is that kind of multiplication of two probability distributions to figure out the thing in the middle. And instead what it does is just says, okay, well, there's ambiguity here. I'm going to choose sometimes the priors, choose sometimes the evidence. It kind of is a heuristic because it kind of gets you close to the right solution. On average, you're going to be pretty close. But it's not at all having to do the computation that you needed to do. So it's heuristic in the sense that it uses a shortcut to get to a solution that's almost optimal without having to do all the complicated steps that's necessary. Does that make sense? Cool. So not optimal, rather they are using stitching heuristic. I'll just show you that, when we do this in the lab, we formally test these things by building computational models and testing to see which, whether our data conforms to a Bayesian observer or what Steve called a switching observer. So there's a lot of sort of model building and thinking about, which model best explains the data to prove these sorts of points. I won't go through all that, but just to say that's how we go about showing these things. We fit these models, I don't know if you can see the lines through the data points. Those are fits of models of the switching model to the data. You can fit both the means and standard deviations, as well as these are a depiction of all the different probability distributions. But that's kind of a sense of like what we do in the lab is that once we collect all the data, then we build models and test to see which of the models is a better fit to the data to try to really show what it is that people are doing. And I guess I'll just, I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm just going to tell you that turns out there's lots of heuristics. So I didn't realize this when we started these experiments, but then I started going back into the literature and realizing there's lots and lots of heuristics that people have proposed for how perceptual Bayesian inference could happen. I'll just put these up here without explaining what they are, but to say that people found lots of different ways that you can take shortcuts to getting almost the optimal solution. And that throughout the literature, there's lots of examples of these things. And so I wanted to just end in this last slide to sort of give you what my thinking is now about sort of thinking about these kind of two different literatures, one on perceptual inference and optimal Bayesian perceptual inference, and this other from judgment and decision-making about, people as being heuristic. And I think I'd like to put it back into like the thinking that, that came from David Marr about different levels of explanation that's required in neuroscience. And I think the way that I think about it now is to think about, well, maybe what it is that we should think about optimality as what Marr called the computation. What is the goal of the system, right? So computation, what he meant by computation, what is it trying to solve? What is the goal of the system? And optimality is a good way to think about, defining what the goals are. So I can define in the motion direction task what the right way to do the task is. That's what the system is trying to achieve. But when we think about how a biological system or a human system or an animal system or a brain system is solving it, they might have constraints, right, about how they can achieve that. I can write down on a computer program quite easily if I just want to dump a lot of computing power into this problem, how to optimally do it. But when you're going about things in your daily life or the perceptual system is trying to interpret things all the time, it has constraints. Maybe there are energetic constraints about how the brain uses energy or how the brain uses computation. And those constraints might lead to quicker, faster solutions, heuristic solutions. And the way to think about, I think, this interplay between optimality and heuristics is to think about them as sort of different levels of explanation within the nervous system. Optimality is really about the goals that are trying to be achieved, where there's selective pressure for us to solve problems that are important for our survival at the best way that we can, but there's also limitations of what the biological circuitry can do, which leads to sort of heuristic or faster solutions to them. And that's sort of more of the algorithmic level, and that sets us up for trying to understand better the implementation level, how now the brain solves it. I don't have to think about, oh, neurons are computing probability distributions and multiplication. I'm thinking now, well, the brain has information about priors and evidence, and it doesn't have to multiply them together. It must be implementing them in different ways, and I can go look for those implementations. And I will end with that. And I think I only have a few minutes for questions, but I'm happy to take any questions that you guys have.